Have you ever been on a boat, Jen?
Yes, I have.
Oh my God, that's right. We literally were on one when we were in LA.
Yeah, we were whale watching.
Yeah, I totally forgot about that. Do you remember how it felt when we went over like that really big lip?
Yes, I remember he was like telling us like how deep the water was in one area, and then he just like kind of went over and he was like, and this is like 130 feet below. And I was like, oh my God.
Yeah. I remember that it was like, okay, it was like blue water, like totally fine. We can see the bottom. And then all of a sudden, within 1 second, it was like total inky blackness. Like,
Yeah, and then I remember like we were in a small little dinghy boat, so I was like, I have to trust this person with my entire life, and I can't see land. Like, what will happen if we tip over?
yeah, like it was like a proper like just like rubber dinghy boat. And I remember when we were walking down to the docks, it was like there were all these like boats that were like, oh, it's the Titanic, and they were having wine. And I was like, yeah, we got a boat just like that. And then all of a sudden the boat like pulled away and it was like the dinghy boat, and they're like, oh, hey guys, this is the boat.
Yeah, because we brought like, because we got like really cheap wine from Target, and we were like, oh, we're gonna take this on the boat, we'll take a few pictures, and then we get to the boat and we're like, oh my God, I don't think we'll be able to drink on this.
Yeah, we were so handy.
Do you remember when I like had that salad and I had to like step on it because it was gonna fly off?
Yeah, I remember we had our hair done so nice, and we were like, oh yeah, the pictures from this are gonna look so good because we were on a revenge trip too. So
Yes.
yeah, I'll always remember how fucking scary it was that we were like, I don't know, that it was just like emptiness and no boats for miles around. I mean, there was like those big like shipping boats, but they were so far off in the distance.
Yeah, and you couldn't even see the land.
Yeah, it was like the ocean just swallowed us. And that's kind of the experience you have in the middle of the ocean as well. Like the air is just so choppy. The waves, like sometimes they'll be calm, but most of the time it's exactly like you kind of see on like those like yo ho, all hands kind of like TikTok videos, if you know what I'm
I
talking
know.
about.
Yeah, I know exactly.
Yeah. And it's like these giant waves are crashing into you. It's freezing cold, and the ocean is trying its best to swallow you. And that's not even like the scariest part, these like 60-foot waves. There's also like the underneath and the unknown that's below you. I think it's called, what is it called? It's called not tryptophobia, agoraphobia.
I think agoraphobia is like the afraid of like leaving your house.
I would be afraid of leaving my house if I didn't know what was underneath me in the ocean.
Oh, are you talking about like the fear where it's like things that are submerged underwater?
Yeah, thalassophobia.
Yeah.
Yes, that's what it's called. So, anyways, there's like, I don't know, there's like giant great white sharks. We all know that. And then there's like giant squids. Everything's giant except for if you're a sardine, then you're not so giant. But you never know. If you like fall in the ocean, it's like, okay, well, is the ocean gonna kill me first, or is what living in the ocean gonna kill me first? And that's kind of where today's case takes place. It's the tale of 10 Aussies that were in a battle for survival in the Southern Ocean, fighting for their lives. And it was one of the greatest searches of Australian history. The sea is a grave of millions of species, and I always find myself enthralled with watching like the deep underwater special where like there's like those crabs that come over, and there's all these like fish that want to eat like the decomposing corpses, but the bottom of the sea is littered with the corpses of everything from great blue whales to land-based creatures whose curiosity has drawn them into the abyss. It's the home to skeletons and carcasses of shipwrecks. Throughout history, lots of humans have tried to make their journey over the largest bodies of water our planet has to offer, with many of them forever being lost to the waves and the waves of time. And for the crew of today's case, they were staring the grave in the face as their boat capsized. Hi, and welcome to the Decomposing Flower podcast. We're excited to have you here with us as we delve into some truly intriguing and occasionally disturbing true crime cases. I'm your host, Kira, and with me is Jen. Everything we say in our podcast is information we've gathered from testimonies, interviews, documents, and trustful sources. Any opinion we say is our opinion. Today's case takes place from the tale of the lone survivor of this tragedy. So everything I watched on today's case was from his kind of testimony and what kind of happened. There wasn't too many other people that commented on today's case. So keep in mind there might be a little bit of bias as far as that goes. But if we get any information wrong or you want to keep adding to the case, let us know in the comments. We mean no disrespect to the victims or anyone affected by today's case. Today we're going to be discussing the Blythe Star, which is a boat that capsized off in a 2-day journey to King Island. Before we get started, I just want to give a few trigger warnings. If you don't like the ocean and you're kind of afraid of like shipwrecks, if you're like Castaways was a really scary movie, maybe don't listen to today's case. There is some deaths that happen, nothing too triggering, but if any of that is upsetting or you feel like this isn't the episode for you, please take care of yourself and watch one of our other episodes, sip a tea, get some snacks going, and with that being said, we'll get into today's case. Where were you when you were 18 years old, Jen?
I was same place where I am right now.
God damn. When I was 18, I remember I had gotten maybe my 5th job at the time, and I was going to uni. I was just doing my thing. I was also chilling at my mom's house. High five to mom. But for Mike, this was one of his first jobs, and he had just joined the crew on the ship called the Blythe Star. This was one of his first times ever going out to sea with this crew. It was a 10 crew board life craft. She was kind of small, not too big of a boat, but she got the job done. We love that for her. And so far, she'd been in operation for a good long while. It's hard to say how long. Not a lot of sources said for how long. It was pretty easy, pretty routine. They were just going to set sail for a 2-day journey to the King Island. Mike was the youngest of all the 10 crew members aboard, and what they were carrying was a cargo of fertilizer and beer kegs. There were 2 ways to get to King Island. The East Coast was safer, but the West Coast was faster. If you ran into a storm on the West Coast, it was pretty horrific. If the East Coast was having bad weather, then you would go to the West Coast. Vice versa. If the West Coast was having bad weather, you would just take the East Coast one. The ship was really weather dependent. If there was a bad storm, of course, maybe things would have been called off or they would have just gone the other way. It was all up to the captain to make the decision based off of the weather. He wasn't really obliged to tell any of the crew members which way they would have set sail. It just kind of was like, okay, well, he knows. He knows. Why would we question it, you know? So they'd been at sea for about 8 hours. And when Mike went to take control over the wheel, it was between the hours of 2 and 4 a.m. He had just finished his shift, took a shower, and went to bed. I've never been on a boat when it's meant to be like nighttime, but because this was like such a small boat, imagine you're like trying to go to sleep and the waves are just rocking you side to side. I feel like anytime I would close my eyes on like a boat and I'm like rocking side to side, I would get so motion sick. So I really don't know how all these sailors do it, especially when they're on this smaller boat.
Yeah.
But you're laying in the cot, you're just in your boxers or, you know, your bra or whatever you're wearing to go to sleep. And it's kind of normal for things to go side to side. But all of a sudden, the ship took a really strong list to the side. So much so that it throws you out of your bunk, which is kind of a rude awakening. But you come back into bed thinking, okay, that was just a freak wave. It won't happen again. The ship righted itself. You hop on the edge of your bed, try to relax, take some deep breaths, maybe massage your arm from falling off the bed, when all of a sudden, the ship creaks over again, this time incredibly hard. You're thrown into the wall. At this point, you knew something was wrong. Running out of your bunk, you see your fellow crew member. He's in the laundry room trying to hold on to a porthole that had been cracked open. There's water gushing through it. Like an immeasurable amount of water is coming out from this poor hole. And you kind of look at each other, and even though you don't feel panicked, there's something unmistakable about being in a life or death situation where sometimes you don't need words to communicate. It's just the feeling. And the feeling right now is run. This ship is going down. There's so much water in the ground. When you first left your cabin, it was at your ankles. Now, within minutes, it's at your knees. There's water coming through the side of the porthole. There's water coming through the exit. There's no control. You can't just grab like a bucket and try to empty out all the water. You can't just get like a little hose and try to suck out all the water. This is a lot of water. You don't even know if you're going to make it to the exit in time. The fear of drowning is real. Then you see another one of your crew members. He's over by the ladder, calling you over. You try to slog through all this water, and it's like someone has a grip on your ankles as you're trying to climb your hardest to this ladder. The sea has its grip on you, and it doesn't want to let go. You finally make it over to the ladder when you start to climb up, and you just made it up onto the deck when you can see that this ship is already fully on the side. It's just hovering above the water. Being on a boat in the middle of the ocean is already scary, but when it's on its side and taking on water, it's probably the scariest thing you're ever going to experience. For these crew members, as they climb onto what was previously in the water, the very edge of their bed or their boat, it was their entire world, and you're watching it slowly disappear from under you, knowing that there's nothing else out there. They couldn't even get to the lifeboats, which were on the other side of the boat, and this ship was going down fast. Luckily, as the rest of the crew managed to climb out of the boat, one of them had grabbed a life raft. And so all of them are holding on, trying and hoping that this life raft was going to be just enough and it was actually going to be able to open, because there's a good chance it's like a parachute. Like most of the time, it'll catch you if you're jumping out of a plane. But there's always that one chance where, who knows, maybe it was too old, or someone wrapped it improperly, or maybe it got damaged in the packaging where there's going to be a hole and the thing isn't going to inflate. So everyone's holding their breaths, hoping that this thing will actually open. So they climb into the water. It's freezing cold. The ship sunk. What should you do? Well, a large ship like this will actually pull you down with it. As the water rushes to fill the air pockets on the ship, it'll create a void as it is leaving the surface. So as soon as you're on the side, you have to try to swim away from the ship as far as you can, because otherwise it'll take you down with you, whether you're in it or out of it. And for a couple of the members on the ship, they actually couldn't swim. Do you want to know something else that happens when a ship goes down?
What?
I think it's easy to remember like wooden ships, and like you just put like a wooden boat on the water and it would sail. But with the introduction of like industrialism and everything, it's important to remember that there's oil and gas. And when a ship goes down, all that oil and gas gets out and into the water. So as you're trying to swim away from the ship, there's going to be wreckage, and it vomits up debris, which is sometimes life rafts or random pieces of pottery or clothes. But you're trying to tread water. You're trying to push yourself as far away from this life source that it used to be. And it's scary, but you have to also swim through all this fuel oil. So as soon as you get to whatever's going to hold you on to the next hours of your life, you have to puke. You have to try to get out all that water that's tainted with the oil so you don't end up poisoning yourself. And even though you're trying to puke all this oil out of your system, it's best not to try to rinse yourself off of all the oil,
Oh.
because it can actually act as sunscreen.
Oh.
Yeah. But the more you hurry, the worse you kind of end up being, because you'd make yourself tired that much more quickly. And especially if you're going to be out in the water for a long, long time, you want to save as much energy. Try not to sweat as much as you can. As they were able to swim away from the ship, they were able to deploy the life raft, and luckily it inflated. All the crew member were able to climb aboard, and that was just in time to turn back and look at their ship completely disappear underneath the ocean. If it was a normal day and they were on like a safe life vessel, maybe it would have been kind of cool to look at. It's kind of a spectacular sight, seeing a ship just lift right off into the air and disappear, the stern going down first, then followed by the bow. It's kind of cool in a way, just watching the ocean eat a ship, because that's something that doesn't ever happen, or it shouldn't really happen. But just like that, it was gone. Most ships are designed to stay afloat for as long as possible. In fact, most of them are supposed to float for a minimum of 30 minutes. But in this case, 30 minutes was not elapsed. It was a matter of seconds. If anyone had taken longer on the ship, they wouldn't have made it. It's overwhelming watching your ship disappear. It's such a feeling of loss. You're grateful to survive, but you almost kind of grieve for the ship that went away. And it's so important to keep your cool as a boat is sinking. During the sinkings of the SS Arctic and the SS Bourgogne, crew members did anything they could to save themselves at the expense of their passengers. It's alleged that on the SS Arctic, a boatload of crew members seized a lifeboat for themselves before lowering it with the claim that they were trying to plug the hole in the ship. Passengers who approached later claimed to have revolvers pointed at their face by the crew members.
What?
Yeah. Who simply cut the lifeboat loose upon reaching the water and drifted away.
That's crazy.
Yeah. Ultimately, 62 people survived the sinking. All of them were males, the majority of the crew members. Well over 400 people, including every single woman and child, were killed. A similar trend unfolded on the French steamer nearly 44 years later, resulting in only one woman surviving. Her name was Victoria, who swam with her husband to a lifeboat, surviving, while every other child was killed. During the sinking, it was said that 40 women had occupied one of the lifeboats, but due to the chaos on the deck of the boat, it was never launched. So the first night at sea, it was terrifying. There was no moonlight. They were hungry, wet, cold, and they had no idea what was lying beneath them. All they could hear was the waves constantly crashing into them. By the way, the shelter kind of has like this orange barrier over them, so they couldn't even see the waves that were coming into them. You never know when the next one would come. Probably the scariest thing was knowing that if a wave knocked you off or capsized the life raft, you wouldn't have the strength to get back on. Everyone was so physically drained. All their adrenaline was wasted. Most of them expected rescue to happen the next morning. They just thought that if they held out through this night, this dark black night, that hopefully rescue would come. There was no light on the boat, so they just sat there in the dark. The waves were relentless, and they were deliriously tired. It's an incredible, uncomfortable experience, not only due to the action of the ocean, but also the seasickness would have been 110% worse compared to what it would have been on the boat, even though it's not ordinarily prone to it. In a small life raft, everyone probably would have been suffering some form of seasickness. The longer they stayed on the boat, the less and less debris was around them, until there was absolutely nothing but empty ocean around them. They tried to stay in good spirits by saying, okay, well, that's the worst thing that could have happened to us. But they were so wrong. The last person to get on to the raft was Ken Jones. He was the chief officer. There was the captain, George Knark, Al Simpson, and then Malcolm McCarroll, and then John Slow, the second engineer, Cliffy Langford, who was an old World War II veteran. He actually had experience with sinking on a life vessel, so that was nice that he has experience, but maybe not nice for him. There's John Eagles, who was the chief engineer, Stanley, and that was pretty much everyone who was on this raft. The men of the Blythe Star escaped with their lives. They were only 10 kilometers off the Tasmanian coast when their life raft should have been found within hours. But this was probably the worst part. When they asked the captain, did you get a mayday off to the mainland? He simply said no.
Oh.
Yeah. He wasn't able to get an SOS out. And this was pretty devastating to the morale on the life raft. They were in the middle of the ocean, and nobody in the world knew where they were, or even the fact that the ship had gone down. On the life raft, they had emergency supplies of glucose powder, biscuits, metal cans of water, 2 oars, and flares. So that's not a lot of food. And at first, when you see that much food and think about rationing it, you're naturally worried. You can have panic and difficulty finding your breath. After that, it's kind of survival mode, which normally comes when you're hungry. You do anything just to eat or drink to stay alive. It's how our bodies are made, and normally we can react to it pretty well, especially like as we are right now. We can just go to like Walmart or Superstore and pick up what we want to eat. But that's not so easy when you're in the middle of the ocean. It's kind of like you get to this place of hope where you can imagine tasting a cheeseburger, and it gives you motivation to keep going. If you can just keep going, you're going to be able to get that McDonald's fry that you want. Depending on how you survive the shipwreck, you could find yourself struggling for days, hours, weeks, or months without seeing the faintest flicker of hope, leaving people who have been stranded little choice for survival. I mean, there's hopes and prayers, sure, but that doesn't feed you. Some people have to resort to cannibalism, or they just resign themselves to the mercy of the sea. In 1884, 4 men had survived adrift at sea after their yacht, the Marinette, had sunk, leaving them to pick straws to see who would have to be consumed for the survival of the other 3.
Oh my God.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, this probably came to the mind of those 10 lost men at sea as they tried to maintain their position the best they could to see the coastline. But every day they would drift just a little bit further south. And then the next day, just a little bit more south, until they were kind of joking about it. But they thought they were going to end up at the South Pole with how much they were drifting. They would often joke to themselves about seeing penguins or seeing what's on the other side of the world because they drifted so far. It was at this point, after a couple of days, John became very worried because he had left his medication aboard the ship. He really, really wanted to go back for his medication, but he didn't. He said there wasn't enough time. Ken Jones had a moment of hope for the crew when he saw that there was fishing vessels out on the sea. There's a Japanese fishing vessel one day within eyesight, and Ken, who was a natural-born leader, got a flare and fired it off. The vessel simply turned and went back the way they came.
Oh.
You could see the hope leave Ken's eyes. As he said, they deserted us. They all thought they were saved when they saw the boat, but it was just a momentary sight, and then they were alone again. And they were all beginning to get very worried. They were pretty sensible in the beginning to ration out the water in tiny amounts. Everyone got about an egg cup a day for water, except for when it rained. Then they were able to harvest the rain off the life raft. It was exceptionally cold at night, but when the sun comes up, that's when the real danger occurs. The more the sun warms up the ocean kind of acts like a giant plate, and it reflects all this heat back at you. So it's very easy to get very badly sunburned. And it's almost impossible to stay hydrated as you're going to sweat. And combined with that and not having enough water, you start to get heat stroke and sleep deprivation, which makes it really hard to get a grasp on reality. No one had any clue where the crew were. They didn't even know where the ship sunk. But after 3 days of being out of radio contact, search began. But there was a huge storm that came by, and it was really hard to even get planes out to go search for them. There was about 10 aircraft they sent out, 10 or 14, some sources say, and they tried to search by lights, I think they said at one point, on these aircraft, but none of them were able to find any sign of them lost at the ocean. On the raft, they also had worries. They had those metal cans, right, that they kept their water in.
Mm-hmm.
Well, those cans were a worry because anything sharp could cut the raft and they would be cast into the sea.
Oh.
So they had very strict rules about the use of the can opener and the pocket knife and where they kept the metal cans. Malcolm, after a couple of days, had a good idea, or maybe just an idea, that if they got as close as they could to the island, then he would try to swim. And he said he's a good swimmer. As they were floating in the ocean, there would be bumps, not only from waves, but from sharks and from killer whales.
Oh.
And luckily, Ken was able to dissuade Malcolm from going swimming because he knew he wouldn't have made it.
Oh my God.
And the state they were in, they were getting so weak. As you're lost at sea, your brain starts to play tricks on you. You would see park benches, palm trees, people in the water having a good time. You would see cars or other boats, things that you wanted to see, images of salvation. And you would think to yourself, oh, why don't I just swim to the boat? It's right over there. I can make it. I'll save us. Don't worry. It'll be okay. You would fall into micro sleeps. And if you were close enough to the exit of the raft, you might fall into the water. It was really up to your crew members to keep you safe. But it wouldn't be long before one of them would become seriously ill. Johnny, or John, looked very feeble until he got worse and worse and worse. Eventually, he ended up passing away. It's not known exactly what he passed away from, but sources say it was probably due to the medical condition he had. The crew members agreed to keep him aboard, even though he had passed, as they thought his body deserved to go to his family when they found them. So they had him aboard, and it was very, very sad for all of them because they thought all of them would be found alive. Like I said, this was kind of the biggest air search ever taken for Australia. There is 14 aircraft, but it was really hard because no one knew whether they should look east or west, and it was looking for a needle in a haystack. They were all looking for a 44-meter steel-sided ship, but none of them were able to spot the life raft. There was no metal parts or anything floating in the water, and it was undetectable by the radar. That's not to say the crew didn't try to make themselves more visible. They kept aluminum foil from the biscuits and the metal cans on the outside of the raft to act as radar reflectors. Unfortunately, it didn't work, and after a while, exactly a week, the search was called off. In the raft, the men had only seen one plane, and it was perhaps the only one that came by. But it was flying really high. You could hear it for miles away. They screamed and shouted, but it never came near them, and after that, they never saw anything else. After a while, the men came to the conclusion that they were not going to be rescued in the short term. So they took John's body and gave him a burial at sea. They were adrift for 8 days, and they had drifted 400 kilometers up and down the Tasmanian coast. But for whatever reason, they were getting so delirious, and it might have been due to the alcohol or the beer that was aboard. But they would wake up, and eventually they had a shore in sight. But it was never a safe place to land. There were these massive rocks that came out of the ocean and straight up into the air. That was about 4 or 3 of them, and there were gaps where the water flew through them. Eventually, they came to the idea that maybe they could squeeze through them. But altogether, all the men got together with the oars and started paddling like crazy. After 8 days, they were about to give up. But They started paddling and paddling. They eventually hit land on this island. As Mike touched the ground, he couldn't believe his eyes as he was able to touch what were the rocks. He swore to himself he was never going to let the raft drift off again, and in no way he was ever going to get back in the raft again. For these men, especially Mike, who couldn't swim well enough, they jumped into the water and pulled the raft onto the beach. But that was when they realized they couldn't walk. Everyone just collapsed. They tried to get up and they collapsed again. Everyone's legs had been in constant motion and kind of crinkled up, so their whole stability was gone. But eventually everyone got ashore and they just fell over. It took a while, but eventually they got their balance back. And nearby there was a freshwater stream where they drank their fill. For them, they thought, oh, they'd finally made the beach, they made the land, everything is going to be fine. But then, just then, they realized there was a huge mistake they made. There was a sheer cliff on the other side of the beach. There was pretty much no way to get out of here. The men had just landed in one of the most remote spots in Tasmania. It was surrounded by entirely steep cliffs and almost impenetrable forest. Someone from the group said, we might have to get back into the raft. Mike, in his own head, thought, no way am I getting back into that raft. And so he got the knife and cut up the raft.
Oh my God.
He said, I'm going to walk my way out of this and see how it goes. One of the crew members gave him a $10 note and said, if you were able to find a shop, get me a carton of cigarettes. So he put the $10 in his underwear, as that was his only clothes that he had, and he kept that $10 note to go buy the cigarettes later on. Keep in mind, during this time, the search had been called off, so no one was even looking for them. And they certainly wouldn't have looked for them on this island, as it was outside of the search area. They all slept for what felt like hours. It might have been a day that they actually slept, to be honest. But after that, Mike woke up and he walked to the beach where the water met the soil. And he saw Ken in the beach. He was sitting on a rock and he had taken his cardigan off and he was dead. Mike pulled his body up onto the dry land when he noticed Ken had also taken his overalls off. It's a phenomenon that happens with hypothermia, where you feel so hot, so you take off your clothes, but it just accelerates your death. So 2 men had passed away, John Eagles and Kenneth Jones. Dying of dehydration isn't necessarily like a physical pain. Mentally, it's almost unbearable. You feel sick, dizzy, mentally and physically drained, like you're on the verge of death. It's a nightmare mentality. Physically, you don't feel much pain. You just pass out and die. Dying from dehydration is not necessarily prolonged suffering, but rather a gradual decline in energy and mental alertness. The initial stages are marked by thirst, dizziness, and potentially delirium, followed by eventual organ failure and ultimately death. You would do anything to quench your thirst, but you'd be full of the most agonizing headaches, and you wouldn't be able to tell what's up and down, especially when you've just been stuck at sea. All these men would have had sunken-in eyes, rapid breathing, a lot of delirium, which is mostly just confusion, restlessness, and incoherent thoughts. But the worst part probably was all the mad dreams that they would have. They had all dreams about helicopters and landing and being taken away. So the next morning, they knew they had to get out of here, otherwise they were all going to die. It was freezing as it was October, so what they decided to do was cut the raft up further and made a poncho kind of thing, as well as foot protection. There were 3 men who volunteered to go into the jungle and try to find help. So as they climbed, it was really like you were pushing through a wall. This jungle was so thick. They were making meters in an hour. They kept pushing and pushing and pushing. They had the mentality that they would never go back to the beach unless they had a search party. They just saw 2 of their shipmates die, and for all they knew, the rest of them were going to die. Eventually, and I don't know how long it took them, but they found a road. It could have been a road to anywhere, but it was a road. They were all so happy to see some sign of civilization. And it was a toss-up. Which way is the right way? Do you go right or do you go left? And they decided they went right. When eventually they hear this noise, it was a truck. He had gotten about halfway through a slight curve when he saw these two guys standing on the right side of the road. They looked very bedraggled. They had parts of the life raft cut up for vests and flaps. And what particularly caught this truck driver's eye was what they had on their feet. They had layers of rubber wrapped around their feet for footwear. Yeah. He thought they were escaped convicts. So he almost locked up his windows and drove off. But in the end, he didn't. He rolled down his window and asked what's going on. And they said they were from the Blythe Star. His response was, "No, you aren't. They're dead." They called the search off. They said, "No, it's us. It's us." And so he let them get on his truck. And the other person who had gone on the search with them was a little delayed, but he eventually caught up, and all three of them took off to go to the authorities. They remember when they were able to talk to their family because their family presumed them dead. One of them called their daughter, and he remembers saying, "Hey," she said, "Hey, who's this?" The policeman said, "I've got your father here." And then he put the ringer to her father's ear. And she said it sounded like a very old man, a very tired old man. She said, "Who's there?" And it was her dad. So Robert said, "I'm your father. I'm alive." She said, "No, my father's dead." At this time, she was only about 13 or 14. He reassured her again and by saying, "No, it's me." And the whole time she thought it was a hoax. That was until eventually he called her Pet. That was his nickname for her. And so she cried. And then he said, "We'll put your mother on." And her mother came over and did the same thing. She didn't believe that it was him. And you're probably wondering, okay, so they found help, but why did this ship go down? Why did the tragedy occur? And there's a whole bunch of speculation as to why it happened. No one's like 100% sure, but all the evidence says that the ship was overloaded. In fact, a similar incident actually occurred on the Blythe Star 6 months before it sank. The ship was turning. It went over to the starboard side, the same side that sank. It listed about 35 degrees before it righted itself, and the captain gave orders to fill the ballast tanks. The Blythe Star led to eventual changes in Australian maritime law. Every ship in Australian waters must report its position once a day and lodge its voyage plans before it even sets off. Emergency indicators, called IRUPs, must be carried on life rafts. Canvas life rafts must be made of reflective material that reflects radar. The loss of the Blythe Star led to the development of modern maritime operating principles. This is something comforting to the families, to the men that died, knowing they didn't die in vain. It goes without saying, some of the most complicated and well-researched aspects from a shipwreck are the psychological point of view, which may not even come from the short-term or the long-term perspective, but the long, lingering effects that can even break the most strong-willed person's character over the course of many months, years, or decades. Even among ordinary sailors and crew members who survive, the sensationalized headlines that break up around the world, which forced the men to be escorted under police protection from mobs during their arrival, where an inquiry was to be conducted. Despite the courts declining them of any charge, the surviving crew members on the grounds of the surviving crew members who made it off of that ship didn't get any charges.
Wow.
What happened to them, more or less, left them unemployed and into social pariahs. For many decades after the sinking, some crew members of the Bourgogne settled in Nova Scotia, not far from Sable Island, where the disaster unfolded, due to not wanting to return to France. Even in the early days of the sinking, crew members seeking charity for themselves or their families were almost universally rebuffed. One person reported a second-hand account of her great-grandmother supposedly confronting one of the crew members at her doorstep. They knocked and explained that they are a father of 9 children. She said, "I am a mother of more than 9 children. Now leave." Surviving crew members from the Titanic. We all know the Titanic, right?
Yes.
While not receiving the harsh attitude that their predecessors had inherited, they themselves were left with little career choice within the liner industry, more so within the White Star Line, which refused to grant a ship's command to any of the surviving officers. Richard Hitzman, who was the helmsman at the time of the iceberg collision, and then was sent into Lifeboat 6, became a violent offender in his later years, suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder following the incident. He had at least one suicide attempt with a firearm. Frederick Fleek, one of the two lookouts, who was also assigned to Lifeboat 6, would battle with post-traumatic stress disorder for many decades, where he would repeat night after night that there was some way he could have prevented the collision from happening. Regardless of what Fleet may have done or not, when his wife found him on the brink of being evicted in his twilight years by her brother-in-law, who reportedly referred to Fleet as useless, he eventually hung himself in the backyard in 1965, where his brother-in-law found him. Meanwhile, Richard Lee, the second lookout, died barely a year after the sinking. Archibald Gracie, who had been rescued from the water and tried to dedicate his time towards writing a first-hand account of the tragedy, as well as conducting many related interviews, subsequently died less than 8 months later at 58. She had been found by a passing lifeboat, even though none of her parents would survive. According to her close relatives, she became so frightened at the sound of running water that she could not even bear to turn on the bathtub without assistance. An Italian captain named Piero Calamai of the ill-fated SS Andrea Dora would later say, "I used to love the sea, now I hate it." He subsequently retired and never returned to the sea. In the later years, when he was on his deathbed, his final words, according to the surviving family members, as he was in a semi-state of consciousness, was, "Are the passengers safe?" Why the Blythe Star sunk was apparently because it was overloaded. It's supposed to never have more than 25 to maybe 30 tons. On the final voyage, they had 54 tons. They eventually found the wreck in 2023, 150 meters under the water, 10.5 kilometers off the coast. And to this day, you can still faintly see the word star visible on the bow of the ship. Some of the ship has been scraped off by fishing nets and due to the passage of time, but the life raft the crew used is on display in the Maritime Museum of Tasmania. Many myths have been intertwined with history as far as sailing goes. They make a great point for tales of people who love a good story, just like we do, right? But one of the greatest legends of them all is the claim that the captain must go down with the ship. There's no actual rule that actually exists about that. In fact, one of the greatest ironies is that the captain is most likely to survive, whereas women and children are the least likely to see the rising sunset. To make things more realistic and eyebrow-raising, I'm going to say that during the sinking of the Titanic 100 years ago, where there are more than 3 times the women that survived the men, was perhaps an exception to this rule. This is because the captain specifically ordered that women and children went into the lifeboats first. But this is rather the exception than the rule. This is because the captain, Edward Smith, threatened to shoot men unless they yielded for the women to go into the lifeboats. He went down with the ship. Of the 1,496 people that perished with the Titanic, 73% of the women and 50% of the children survived compared to only 20% of the men. The Titanic is not a representative of maritime disasters in general. Women are about half as likely to survive as men. They found crew members were about 18% more likely to survive than passengers, no matter how much time it took a ship to sink. I don't think the captain should go down with the ship for the sake of going down with it. But one thing you should do is make sure all the passengers are safe, or until you know you've done everything you can to save them. That's where we're at for today's case. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Take care of yourself, and we'll see you in the next episode.